So, hey, friends, welcome to another edition of AppScan Tuesday. And for this session, I thought it would be fun to talk about a topic that we're kind of seeing emerge in the marketplace, a little tendency that we think is starting to bubble up, and that's the intersection of security with testing. So, I have with me a good friend of mine, a fellow HCLite named Alan Gay, who's an expert in the space. I'll let Alan introduce himself in a second, but we kind of thought that this would be an area where you can start seeing more of an impact in your pipelines and things like that. We did a study a couple of years ago where we surveyed folks around application security in DevOps, and I was pretty surprised when out of the 630-ish respondents that we had, 11% of them identified as a QA professional. And so we're starting to see this kind of tendency of QA teams, testing teams, at least getting asked to participate a little bit. And so I thought it'd be great to have a conversation around that. So, Alan, how are you? Why don't you introduce yourself and how you doing?
Thank you, Rob. I'm great. So I started off in computer science technology back in 1988. I was a business partner for, rational products, including AppScan and OneTest that we're using now since then. And today I'm happy to join you to talk about testing and how it relates to security. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess, Alan, to kind of kick things off a little bit, I mentioned the study that we did with the Ponemon Institute. So I'm kind of curious, are you seeing any of that kind of same stuff? Or what would you say is kind of the current lay of the land, if you will, or the state of kind of security when it comes to QA teams and testing?
That's an interesting question. And honestly, that I was surprised to hear the participation of QA people in that session.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because my daily interaction with actual testers that I talk to, and this is across the world, security does not come up. When
Hmm.
I'm actually interviewing testers to see how I can help them build solutions around testing, um, security may come up one out of 100 of those conversations.
Wow.
And so I think we even have a disconnect of the people that we're talking to, you and I.
Hmm. Yeah. So
Um,
do you think that there is a need for it though? Like, is there value for
Absolutely.
security? Yeah.
There is not only a need, but the way I look at security nowadays, it's survival.
Hmm.
That's personally, and as QA testers, software QA testers, QA people, even if your job is to audit processes and come back with suggestions or to help, people deliver software faster and better and with more quality, it depends on your role. But QA in general should be focused on security, if nothing else, for survival for
Hmm.
themselves and for the organizations they represent. Because come to the end of the day, we have to answer. We are the stewards of production, and we are where the buck stops.
That is a really good point, and I'm really glad that you brought up kind of the survival and related to quality, right? Because
Right.
I think we've been talking, certainly for the last couple of years with folks that we know and some other places about this notion of security being a quality metric, right? A part of the overall story. And
Mm.
so to me, it's a natural progression, right? If you're going to do functional testing and performance testing and service virtualization and load testing and all those kinds of things, then and you're trying to answer the question, is my application good to go for production?
Right.
Security should be a part of that discussion, right? It's every bit as
Absolutely.
important. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the way to look that I look at this is that whenever I go to organizations and they start defining what their software development lifecycle is, I find people are either in the Scrum or Agile methodology, or even Waterfall or Agile, whatever you want to call it. But the types of testing you described are different ways to intersect test into the system of record when it concerns technology. Um, and what I notice is the actual testing and software development lifecycle, they typically go through unit testing, functional testing, where it starts involving the testers in a model where the developers are not the system developers, engineers, and test. They have a separate group. So it passes over to them in another development environment or a QA environment. And then most of the time it goes through what's called UAT, user acceptance testing. So all those things that you just listed should be a part of every phase of the software development lifecycle when it concerns testing.
Dang. Yeah, I mean that makes total sense, right? You would think having it intersected everywhere, right? Measuring quality all the way through, not just at a point in time, right? We saw the same kinds of things in the security space, right? Where you don't wait until the end of the pipeline to start doing auditing and testing and running scans and those kinds of things, right? Because then you find that 11th hour vulnerability that just grinds everything to a halt. So do you see more of a need for what I guess we
Right.
would consider traditional testers, traditional QA testers, to be involved in security? And if so, how do they intersect?
That's a good question. So I see testers as in, mainly three categories. I see testers as manual testers, and I see testers that use tools to help automate their testing efforts. And I also see software developer engineers in test. And these are just like software engineers that write the application. You have a separate set of engineers that test the application and create different things to interject test into the application. Now, those people tend to look more at the code, for instance, in terms of white box testing. And in that case, I would say that those people are more in tune with some of the security issues that come at that point. So you could actually interject those people at the code analysis stage to interject security testing at that point. So to me, that would come in, close to unit testing.
Yeah, I think that's where the secure coding practices start to intersect, right? The where we talk about things like
Mhm.
CodeSweep and
Right.
those kind of capabilities. We'll kind of show that a little bit at
Yes.
the end of this, but yeah. So for folks who are using tools to automate, right, and your manual testers, where do you see the value, I guess, for security for them? And you mentioned survival before, which I think is a really cool way of looking at that. So if those folks are looking to continue to survive, where do you think
Mhm.
security can help them do that?
Right. So in that role of testers that meet that skill set, I would say it's very important when they're building automation tool centric. They're probably creating assets that go into a repository and can be executed via CI/CD pipeline implementation or just pushing a button. But in building that automation suite, you start recording manual scripts, you start enhancing those, and you start with a little bitty snowball, and you add, and you create a bigger snowball. And that snowball must have security built into it. So I think it offers testers that use automation solutions basically use solutions from other software tools that would aid in security and meld those together in the same effort. And I think that would help bridge the gap between a normal QA person and a security person, for instance. If we had a solution for that, then they would be able to handle both of those types of testing.
I think that leads right into the next question I was thinking was and bridging that gap, right? So
Mhm.
how do you see security teams, right? And we've seen recently security teams trying to better understand the developer world and the whole
Right.
shift left idea, right? So testers, unfortunately, in a lot of these things, right, they're the ones that are always scrunched on schedule. They're kind of
Yes.
assumed but forgotten, right, when it comes to the pipeline. So, what do you think security teams can do specifically to help testers,
Right.
QA professionals, and thinking about that part, and especially if security is part of the quality discussion, right? How can
Mhm.
security better partner with these other folks that are really responsible for the state of the application?
Right. Well, I think that the security folks are part of the state of the application, honestly. So I think it's got to be a collaborative effort. Um, QA people are usually crunched, as you say. It doesn't matter what you're using to track your software in a pipeline, or in a value stream. You can't change the fact that development, if they're late, they're late. And it seems to happen all the time. QA testers get to work many weekends. So that's an issue. And let me first of all go backwards. So how can testers help security people, right? And the way that testers could help is bring the tester mentality to the security teams if they don't already think in those terms. So how to write valid test case, interject valid data, how to view results, and basically sign off that it's good to go in production without defects. And find those defects as soon as possible, as you said. I don't really say shift left because I don't want to shift anything left, but I would like to test earlier every year and as much as possible. So if you reverse the coin and you ask, how can security help QA? On the same token, security can bring the security mindset into an established QA organization and either be a part of that side by side or as mentors to the QA people to teach them the knowledge of what they need to look for as far as security testing is concerned.
Yeah, yeah, and this is where I'm a big fan of interactive testing and where that intersects, right? So
Right.
if you are a
Mhm.
QA professional today, and let's say you're waiting on those development changes, and I can't believe that everything doesn't happen in a 2 week sprint, right? What are you saying? Things get late,
Oh, come
of
on.
course,
It
right?
does. It
So,
does in a
oh come
maximum
on,
way.
right? Yes, everything happens, right? So, so if you have a passive interactive, security testing going on in your environment, right? So for us, we offer, in that IAST model where it sits in the environment and
Right.
it's looking for and monitoring for security vulnerabilities. You know, so if you're doing your functional testing and you're doing your performance testing and some of these other scenarios in that environment, and you have IAST there, then all of a sudden you're getting more bang for the buck. You're getting security testing right alongside the other testing that you're already doing, and so one of the things I would say to security teams is, hey, great, they're running that for you. Come in and help them understand how to prioritize what they're finding. Understand what they're looking for, being
Absolutely.
able to tell what's a critical vulnerability versus not, right? So that education
Mhm.
piece becomes really, really valuable. And then the thing I love about that so much is, you've heard people say, right, you can't argue with somebody's experience. What you go through
Right.
happened to you, and people can't go, no, that didn't happen, right? It's sort of the same thing with these
Right.
kind of vulnerabilities. If you're running functional testing and you're exercising an application, and all of a sudden IAS says, hey, by the way, there's a vulnerability, well, that's real, right?
Mhm.
Somebody was doing something. They were,
It is.
testing a bank deposit, if you will, right? Or, checking the feature of some new capability, and did it behave properly? So you can't really go, oh, well, that's a false positive, or oh, that one's not really
Right.
exploitable, or oh, that one didn't really happen, because it was right there as you were doing something, right? So,
Right.
so I think that's another place too where that intersection can really happen. So the last question I want to ask you on this, though, right? We've talked about it sort of from the tester side, from the security side. Do you think that there's a business value? Like, what's the overall matter to the business as a whole if we get testing and security working better together?
I think you know my opinion on this. I'm a big proponent of performance testing, as you know, to prepare organizations. And I say two things on this. If you don't performance test, you're basically on the hook that your site could go down in a holiday, if you're a retail site, for instance, and you can lose business and you can lose money. But when it comes to security, if you don't take advantage of your time to test in the software development lifecycle, it could cost you your brand and your company and millions of lives. So I think it's very important that we not only think about these things, but we start putting ourselves to work to do them. So the businesses should be very, very involved in this, the business users, the end users, should mandate that these things be done along every other side of testing, every other side of type of testing, side by side in every aspect of the software development lifecycle, right there with every other type of testing.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to show you a short little video that kind of illustrates just one of kind of the capabilities that we were talking about, this notion of developers being able to get kind of in-context information around security vulnerabilities. So when Alan was talking about kind of the software engineering tester earlier, and just being able to see that and how we've connected that to our OneTest capability to kind of aggregate that together. So we'll let that play for a couple minutes. And then we'll kind of come back, give a couple closing thoughts, and that'll be great. So let's get to that.
Right. So let's get into having a look at the actual software in action, and let's start with CodeSweep itself. So some of you may have taken a look at this already. I was looking at the statistics on the Visual Studio Marketplace earlier, and I think it was about 16,000 downloads and counting for CodeSweep. So it's proven very popular with developers and anyone using Visual Studio Code and having one eye on security. So what is it? What can it do? Chris has kind of introduced the general high level. We'll put a bit more flesh on the bone. So you can see here in Visual Studio Code, I have the AppScan plugin already set up. Like Chris said, each developer needs to install this plugin on their workstation. I've done that already. It's a very quick, easy process. And you can see there's over 30 different languages that CodeSweep can provide vulnerability scanning across. So, for example, if we were to look at C#, we can see a list of the types of things it's going to look for. It's looking for typical vulnerabilities in the use of APIs and the use of encryption and the use of things like SQL for injection and cross-site scripting type problems, the types of patterns that you might expect to be able to knock out quite easily. But it's also looking for typical sort of problems that any developer can fall foul of, where potentially they've left a hard-coded password in some source code that was meant to be there in an early development lifecycle phase, but not meant to be there when we're getting close to production, or they've left the logging levels too high and we're giving away too much information. So there's lots and lots of different rules that are run over our code as we scan it in CodeSweep. So how do we scan the code? Well, let's go into a sample source file, and you get the impression that this bad Perl might be an example of where somebody's written some bad code. So Chris again sort of introduced this idea that it's scanning at an individual file level, and it's scanning at the point when we make a change. So if I were to just add a character into this file and save it, when we go back into our AppScan view, we're going to see now we've identified a single vulnerability in that single file. And we can see it's an insecure use of SQL in Perl. We can click on the individually highlighted error. It's going to show us where that problem is. It's down here on line 36. And the more advanced of us in the group might recognize what the problem is there already, but to the uninitiated, we can click on the information icon and it's going to give us a description of why this use of concatenation in a SQL statement is bad practice and how that can manifest in problems with SQL injection. But it's also going to go on to say how we could mitigate that, how we could produce a prepared statement or use parameters and that kind of thing. So that's CodeSweep inside Visual Studio Code. That's the developer experience. Now, how do we use that in the OneTest world? So let's jump over to OneTest server. I think I'm probably logged in. It might log me out, but let's see. So I've got a project here where I have a number of different test types available loaded into the application server. Some of those are for API testing. Some of them are open source. You can see I've got 35% Postman, 21% performance schedules, but I've also got some AppScan source code that is going to be scanned, and a number of scanning rules that we're going to apply to that. You can see additionally some information about what's going on in the server. I've got some tests scheduled. Some things are passing, some things are failing. In terms of activity, what's going on in the server, you can see down here there's been just today, would you credit it, just today there's been one new file added for scanning of some source code. So how do these tests and assets get into the OneTest server? Well, that's quite easy. They're added by virtue of them being in a Git repository, and I simply pass the repository into the OneTest server project, and we're then going to pull all of the source or all of the test assets or whatever it is we want to be executable into the project for use later on. So you can see up here I've got this aptly named CodeSweep example repository, and I've got that open over here. And just kind of scanning the repository, you'll see there's a range of files in here that we're using as simple examples, different languages, different samples for various vulnerabilities. But the important piece, so far as OneTest server is concerned, is this file, this .codesweep file here. And this is what allows OneTest server to not just look at an individual file, but look across an entire repository, filtering for things that it should look at and filtering out things that it shouldn't look at. So we could set some rules to say include and exclude, but also potentially more importantly to the QA engineers is this idea of having a verdict as a result of a security scan, because more often than not, a security scan is going to find things that it will recommend you look into and that you potentially remediate. And they can be classified as low, medium, or high target vulnerabilities. Obviously, the higher the vulnerability, the more risk you're potentially at. So in terms of providing a verdict, it's hard to say that you'll have nothing show up at the end of a scan. So you and your organization need to set a threshold of your choosing. And that's going to be quite hard to determine, but over time, you'll be able to set a level that is acceptable and historically accurate for your application, and you'll be able to monitor it for trending. So if the last 7 releases we had 3 high-level vulnerabilities, the chances are if we find a 4th in our current build, we've introduced some new problem and we need to go and address that, and we've caught it. So how do we run these scans then in the OneTest server? Or if you're familiar with OneTest server from an automation perspective, it's exactly the same as we would execute a regular test, let me call it. So if I were running performance tests or API or UI tests, I'd come into this execution view and I would run it. Down here, I've got my source code scan. You see the little app scan icon there to help us identify it. And I can simply execute it. I can execute it now, or I can execute it later if I want to schedule it for a particular time. And I can execute it against any version in any branch in our GitHub repository. And I could give it a label. I'll say, this is our webinar label for our scan, and hit execute. And that's now going to go off in our cloud native environment. It's going to spin up a container where it pulls in the source code, executes the scan, shuts down, gives us all the results back, and we can see those results over here in the analyze section. So you see I've been running tests earlier today, so we can have a look at a previous scan. We'll see our new scan pop in here at the top in a minute or two once it's completed. But let's have a look at one that we ran earlier on today. So we can see it passed in the last execution. You can see Stuart ran it. Took about 30 seconds to run the complete scan from start to finish. See what version of the code and git commit was executed against. We can see there aren't any defects related to this in Jira. And we can see the different types of reports over here on the right-hand side. So we present the data in different formats for different types of consumers. There's kind of low-level log information. There's a JUnit report if you want to integrate into, say, a build server or some system that requires or can better present a JUnit report into a dashboard. There's a Surefire report, which is familiar to maybe security consultants. And then there's also our AppScan CodeSweep report. Oh, there we go. It's logged me out because I have exceeded our time threshold. I thought it might do that. I should have logged in earlier. But actually, we can see now our new scan has completed. So we'll go and have a look at the report over here instead of looking at a successful one. Let's have a look at a failed one. We can identify this is our test because it ran as a part of the webinar. These labels, by the way, are generally used for build IDs and where they're triggered from a pipeline or a build server to identify a particular automated environment. So let's have a look at the AppScan CodeSweep report and let's see what we're being told. Well, you remember in our .codesweep file, I said we were going to allow a maximum of 3 high vulnerability I lose the word, vulnerabilities. Let's stick with that. And here we can see in the report, our verdict is that we've failed because exactly that. We allowed for a maximum of 3 vulnerabilities at the high level. We actually found 5. And so overall, the status of this scan is that it's failed. And we can then go down and scroll through and we can see the various levels of failures. We can see there's a medium failure here, and then we can see the 5 high-level failures. And we can even click through into the detail. We can see that bad Perl file we looked at earlier on, and we can see it tells us exactly the cause of the vulnerability and potentially how we could mitigate that. So what else does this tell us? Well, one last thing, let's quickly show you. In the OneTest server, we quite recently added the capability called system models, which helps us to model the overall topology of our landscape. And I've associated this source code scan with the component, the hotel payment service. You have to imagine that this code was for a payment service. Clearly it wasn't. But imagine this was for our hotel payment service. And I can now look at a sort of a high-level summary overview of my application landscape where this hotel payment service is concerned. I can see, generally speaking, we've been having a lot of success. A lot of our tests are passing, but actually in the last hour, I've got one of my performance tests has failed, one of my API tests has failed, and my code scan has failed. So I can start to sort of look at a more abstracted level at the quality and the state of any code in a given environment.
All right, so yeah, so we really enjoyed keeping an eye on what CodeSweep and OneTest are doing. I think it's pretty cool to be able to get some low-level reporting and give folks a first pass at being able to see things kind of associated with changes. So what do you think, Alan? You think that we're going to start seeing a little bit more where security teams and testing teams getting together and seeing some changes in the space and pulling stuff together that way? Or I guess if you could have your ideal, what would you like to see happen as far as security and testing kind of come together?
Right. So I won't put that task on somebody else. I would say that basically any organization that I talk to and I talk to them about testing, I will take that on myself, that I should have that conversation. Are you testing for security? Is one of your quality gates to go into production that you meet certain criteria, that you've tested the application for security concerns? And that should be one of the sign off and gate capabilities before going to production. So I think it starts with us individually. I don't think we can put a mandate out, a blanket mandate out. We're going to have to involve and create cultural change when it comes to the world of, the normal software QA tester. So we need to have those conversations with people, understand where people are at, and work with them to improve.
Perfect. Yeah. And if you are looking to have those conversations, please feel free to reach out to us. Alan, we've had a great conversation. Really enjoyed the time today. Thanks for being a part of this. And look forward to continuing this discussion of security and testing coming together. And who knows, maybe we'll do a follow-up on this. We'll have a whole bunch of other cool things to talk about as the space evolves.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, awesome, man. Well, thanks for being here today.
Awesome, Rob. It's always a pleasure to talk. Thank you. Thank you for having me.